connection is a way leading us to different possibilities. From the mobile phones we use every day, to the games that our kids are playing, to the TV that we watch, to the data centers, which support AI technology. When we look at all the connected world, all the devices we are using, they actually face very similar challenge. The heat inside of these devices builds up, and that long run, it impacts its performance. We can feel it. The device become hot, speed slow down. What I see is DAO plays a crucial role in the devices we use in our daily life. Our solution is thermal management and cooling technology. It dissipates heat much quicker than traditional cooling solutions. DAO's solution reduces the energy needed when it's operating. It also cuts CO2 emission and minimizes the water usage compared with conventional cooling systems. I'm originally from Shanghai, China, so I particularly cherish the time that I can connect with my parents, my close friends. They are still in Shanghai. My daughter also, she really misses her grandparents. We use quite a lot our mobile phone, our tablet, have a video call. I feel lucky. We don't feel the distance. We feel always connected here. We are redefining the boundary of what's possible. It's about innovation.
Wonderful. Hey everyone, Parag Madawar. I'm the Director of Professional Programs here at SASE. I am your host today. Thank you so much for joining us. We've got 230 people. Fantastic. Look at that. We're getting back into the swing of things this January. It feels like January is kind of like taking a little bit to get going. Jessica, your Zoom host today, and I were talking about that earlier this morning. For whatever reason, it feels like it just kind of hasn't started cranking yet. But I don't know. Maybe that's just us. But maybe this webinar will get us out of our seats, ready to go. And so I'm so super pleased to present this webinar today. But let's talk a little bit for those who don't know who we are, what we do, and all that type of stuff, some of this background, why we exist. So SASE Pro, we are focused on what we call the Asian leadership gap. What data has consistently shown is that Asian heritage professionals in the Western world are nearly 50% less likely to be promoted to middle management. This is a huge gap for companies as well as the individuals alike. And we found that there are 4 common reasons why this happens. We believe a significant chunk of it is cultural leadership differences. And the differences can be summarized in these 4: lack of political and organizational savvy, a cultural deference to authority, ineffective communication and influencing skills, and an aversion to risk-taking. Now, there's not a right or wrong. There's just a different. Each of these elements is done differently. And even that depends on where you're talking about and who you're talking about. When you're talking about 49 different countries and multiple different generations, as well as just the difference in people and families and their backgrounds and whatnot. It's not a one-size-fits-all by any means. Now, as we look forward, the challenge, though, is that there are some barriers. One is just even the knowledge of what I've shared so far. 2 is what to do about it. We found that training with cultural context is incredibly important to be able to make transformational change. And then thirdly, what's just very true is that Asian development is often not a top priority. And so with that in mind, we've partnered now with well over 100 organizations and well over 250 ERG and HR leaders to design programs for the overall community. And amongst those is this webinar series. So it's an ongoing free series. So thank you so much for joining us today. We have designed this for those of you who are maybe multitasking, I get it. And those of you who are hyper-focused, you're going to enjoy yourself as well. There's plenty of time and availability to get engaged. We do this about once a month. You can just follow us on LinkedIn to stay up to date. In fact, the next 2 are ready on our website to go register for, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. So the way this is going to work, a brief presentation from our training partner, 15, 20 minutes or so, moderated Q&A with me. And you enter your questions into the chat, and then I will pick and choose from those, and I'll also choose when I want to interrupt our speaker and ask a question. That's take a little bit of creative license there. So with that, without further ado, I want to bring Yue Zhao up on to the virtual stage here. Yue has we've connected with Yue through what's called the Asian Leaders Alliance, ALA. It's a Slack channel actually for Asian ERG leaders, predominantly on the tech industry on the West Coast. But Yue, coming from a background of tech, has gotten very involved with them, and then found us that way, and we connected, and we thought, hey, let's do a webinar in the new year. So here we are, and I'm going to turn it over to Yue for her to do her intro and share with you about advocating for yourself and your ideas. Yue.
Thank you so much. Happy New Year, everyone. I am very happy to be here, and it's my first official event of the year, so never too late in a new year. And so wanted to share with you today about self-advocacy, which I think is a skill set, a leadership skill set that many of us who come from Eastern cultures struggle with, but is so critical in the Western business culture, particularly as you move up the ranks and climb up the ladder. And so let me share my screen. Cool. Before we jump in, wanted to share a bit about my background and where my passions come from. So I was formerly a chief product and technology officer at a Series C startup. Spent most of my career in product and in technology. First PM at Thumbtack. I spent 4 years at Meta and Instagram before transitioning into an executive role at the startup. I also dabbled in entrepreneurship and spent a little over half a year doing early stage healthcare venture investing. So been on both sides of the table, been at small companies, large companies, and guess what? Self-advocacy is a thing across all of them, which we will get into shortly. About a year ago, I officially transitioned into coaching full-time. It's something I've been doing nights and weekends since 2016, primarily with women and minorities, particularly those of Asian descent. There are not many Asian female executives and product leaders, even in places like Meta and Google. And so I found myself in a place where I felt I wanted to give back and I wanted to help these people. And so I wrote a book. Maybe that's not usually not where you kick off your coaching business, but it's where I kicked off mine to really hone in on what are the things that, really help Asian leaders stand out and what are the gaps that are common. And I began writing a newsletter and ultimately teaching in addition to being a coach. And so it is really with more of a coaching mentality that I approach this discussion with you all today. And I look forward to hearing your questions throughout the conversation as well as in the Q&A process. So jumping into self-advocacy, the first question I often get asked is like, what happens when you don't advocate for yourself? Like, what are the signs that this is maybe something you should start considering doing in 2025? The most common thing is actually you get overlooked because leaders and executives are not aware of your accomplishments and involvement, right? On the negative scenario, sometimes this leads to others taking credit for your work. But even in a more neutral state, it just is you doing a lot of hard work, really amazing work, delivering impact and value for the organization, and others are not aware of it. The second is that it may actually be mistaken for a lack of passion or lack of desire to be promoted and to advance in your career. I personally had this happen to me when I was working at the startup. I was doing great. My team was doing great. We were delivering and a high performance team. But I was never tapped on the shoulder for stretch projects or additional roles or things that were coming up. And it turned out that my manager thought I wasn't interested. he said, hey, you seem to be pretty happy where you're at. Everything's going really well. I didn't think you were interested in taking on more responsibility. So it could actually be, this lack of advocacy leads to others thinking, okay, you're probably happy and satisfied where you're at. Last but not least, and this applies to more senior roles as you're going from director to VP, VP to the C-suite. If you're not advocating for yourself and your ideas and your perspectives, what you stand for as a leader, then people don't know what type of leader you're going to be. And the scariest thing for executives is to bring someone who they don't know what they're going to get into a management position or a very senior management position, right? If you think about it from their perspective, they want to know, what type of leader is Yue going to be? What does she stand for? What's the types of things that she cares about? What types of people will she hire? What are the values that she will bring? They want to know because that minimizes downside risk for the executive roles where you have a ton of impact and visibility across the organization. I think minorities in particular, we face a tricky situation when it comes to self-advocacy. First and foremost, Eastern cultures, including how I was brought up, we value mastery. We value getting really good at something, working really hard and getting really good at it. We don't really value talking about the work. In fact, talking about the work is often perceived as a lack of humility, is often perceived as, hey, you're bragging about yourself, and you're boasting about your work. That's internal. Second, externally, minorities are often assessed based on concrete, visible performance. You often hear this when it comes to a gender discrepancy, where men are often promoted based on potential and women on performance. It's the same with ethnicity, and so as an Asian woman, you actually get a nice double whammy. But you're assessed based on visible performance, and so everyone needs to know what that performance is in order to say, like, okay, maybe we should consider Yue for a director level position or a VP level position. Rather than like, okay, maybe she has the potential to do so. So it becomes even more important. Otherwise, you're 2 steps back from, that next step in the career ladder.
Hey,
Last but not least, go ahead.
I'd like to pause on that real quick. So,
Yeah.
Because just to dwell on that for a half second, because you're saying that element itself, there's 2 pieces there. There's one is that minorities and women are less likely or are viewed on their performance, not on their potential. But then there's also on top of that, the minorities are less likely to advocate for themselves. And so, one, we have to advocate for ourselves, but 2, of course, the system has to adjust as well. But if we're not going to advocate for ourselves, it doesn't matter what happens with the system. We're still not going to be seen. So both things need to happen, but it just makes it that much harder if we're not advocating for ourselves. And
exactly.
Yeah. Is there, have you seen studies specifically on this as well? I'd love to be able to tie that out. I've definitely heard the women one before, and it sounds right. I wasn't sure whether or not there were actually any studies that you've seen.
Yes. I don't have the exact citation here, but I'm happy to send it to you in the group afterwards.
Okay.
It was a research study that was done, and based on ethnicity rather than gender.
Wonderful. Thank you. So back to your regular schedule.
Amazing. No, all good. I think it's good to emphasize that point, and just because of how important it is. And I think the last is, you also, on the flip side, when you do advocate, there can be a perception mismatch, right? And sometimes we may be more easily perceived as being too aggressive or rude, simply due to racial stereotypes, right? If you're the model minority, if you're not stereotyped as someone who is, often speaking up and being very direct, when you do that, and there's a change in how you lead and how you talk about your work, it depends on the culture and depends on the people. But for some people, there is a lower threshold for what's viewed as too aggressive, or in my case, I was called intimidating by those who work with you. And I'm not a very intimidating person. I don't come off as intimidating generally, but it is a stereotype that you have to overcome. And so there's so many different things where, to be an effective at self-advocacy, there's your internal mindset, that you have to break through in addition to these external challenges and hurdles to cross. But it's important. As I mentioned, you want the credit for the work, right? You want your visible performance to reflect what you're doing. So very simply, there's a person doing the work, there's a person talking about the work. Usually in Western culture, the person talking about the work with others, mentioning it in different forums at the, over coffee at dinners with leadership is the person who gets the credit. Hopefully that's the same person and both you. But if it's not, if you've been in a situation where like, wait, I was working really hard on this project, I was keeping things going, but then how did this person be viewed as, the leader for this project or be even involved in this project? He did like one thing. It comes down to that second piece, which is, are you talking about the work with others? And so I wanted to share a few tips and methods on how to do self-advocacy for the work that you're doing. For many of us, myself included, it's a bit uncomfortable to just go and say like, hey, here's the thing that I did, right? Hi, Prague, nice to meet you. Here's the thing that I did. It's usually not how conversations go, and most of us are not comfortable with that. And so there's two ways, the alternative formats that I like to use. One is framing your work as a learning for others. And so finding opportunities where you can share the work that you've did as what you've learned in a way that's helpful. So the most direct way to do that, if your company has these types of events, is to hold lunch and learns about what you've learned. So you can position it as like, we've just done this project, we've just done a product launch. Now I want to talk to you about what worked, what didn't work, so that you can all learn from my mistakes. The second is to sort of weave it into regular conversation. I use product reviews here as an example, but any kind of big group team meetings and group conversations, you can say, when I was working on X, I learned this, and here's how it's relevant, right? And so you're really using that first part to say, hey, this is something that I've accomplished in the past. Last but not least, monthly newsletters. This is something that I picked up as a habit since my Meta Instagram days. You write down essentially what your team is working on, what the highlights were, and send it out to a broad group of people you directly work with and your partner teams, as well as leaders who are interested in the work you're doing. This list actually is something you can grow over time internally, because as you meet people, as your project grows, you can start adding more folks to that newsletter. It's a great way for someone to just spend 3 seconds reading your first 3 sentences to be like, oh, okay, Yue and team is working on this.
Wonderful. Can we pause for a half second, Yue?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a couple of questions. One is, the Asians, we often struggle with, in performance reviews, writing down what we specifically delivered, because it feels like we're taking credit for what, realistically, no one does work on their own in a silo anymore. That's just not how work is done, right? And so it feels disingenuous, feels, I don't know, to use the words of the day, inauthentic, if we want to call it, to try and take credit for the entire team by using the word I. So how have you found to kind of get around that? Or is it just kind of like you just gotta exercise that muscle so that you get used to it and become more comfortable with it? Or is there a different way that you've found to kind of work around that while still feeling comfortable with it?
Yeah, the I and we question. So as a product person, that's something that's very near and dear to my heart, right? And at the end of the day, the engineers build and the designers design, the product managers, we help move things along and decisions get made. So I think the question that I always go back to when it comes to something like performance reviews or talking about what's been done, there's a high level, like, what did you accomplish as a group? And this is usually like revenue delivered, users impacted, project launched, etc. That's almost always for me a we statement. We as a team did this. But then you can also add to that, what did you do? What was your role in making that happen? So I led the team in this. I helped resolve these types of conflicts. In some cases, it's enough to say I was the product leader on this particular project. And so I always ask myself, if I wasn't a part of the team, what would have happened? And if the answer is, well, the same thing would have happened and everything would have been delivered on time and like, blah, blah, I'm like, okay, then I probably shouldn't actually be there. Like, I probably wasn't needed. Great. So I can go spend my time doing something else. And so I think it's always worthwhile to ask, like, what would have happened if you weren't there? And the answer to that question is what did you do as a part of that process? And so both and those are equally important. I don't want people to only say the I think the we, like what you accomplished as a team together, especially if it's a team that you brought together, is extremely important. And then I think adding on the like, here's the I piece, is a nice addition to say like, okay, and in case it's not super clear, like here are the various things that I really help drive as a part of this bigger effort.
Gotcha. Thank you for that answer. It is a hard one because there's a little bit of reading the room involved, right? You can't, there's not always no, you should always use the word I, or should always use the word we. There's a bit of understanding what the norms are, the cultural norms of the organization are, right? As well as just taking in the context of what's going on around you. But even recognizing that that's a thing to begin with is step one, right? That awareness, that self-awareness and situational awareness of what's out there to begin with and what are people doing in general. I mean, I think we would probably, most everybody on the call would probably agree that, in general, if our world that we currently work in were to do a little bit more we and a little less I, that wouldn't be a terrible thing, right? Maybe that's my own personal opinion, but and so I think there is a little bit of in general, hey, we as a community do have the power over time to impact this equation as well. So I also don't want to necessarily give the impression that the way it's currently being done is the only way and the right way, right? If there is a morally right way, right? There is a bit of a, hey, we've got to learn how to participate in the current system and then start affecting change as we can.
Yeah. Just to add on to that, one of my go-to phrases, especially as you work at larger companies, is sometimes it's better to be effective than to be right. And so when you are talking about advocacy, every culture has what's effective, and it's relative to what others are saying, what they're doing, how they are advocating for themselves, and sharing or not sharing credit, right? Because if you have a culture where everybody is saying I and trying to claim credit everywhere, and you go in and say we, you're not going to be heard. And everyone's just going to ignore what you just said, right? Yeah. And so there is the what is effective and there is what is right. And sometimes, they don't always overlap as much as you like. And so depending on your priorities, your values, the culture you're in, there's that balance of figuring out where you land on that spectrum.
Yes, I love that answer. Thank you for that. So
no problem.
We have a bunch of questions. I'm going to let you keep going and I'll come back around. Okay.
All right. Sounds good. So in addition to framing it as a learning, you can also frame it as a thank you or a celebration. And so, if at the end of a large project, a big milestone, something you're really proud of individually or as a team, you can create a celebratory post or email, whatever format, works for your company. Name everybody who was involved, the people who contributed, how they contributed, and thank them. It's a way to advocate for the work that you did, but also bring everyone else along in that equation, right? And so it brings attention to this work that you did and also generates, depending on how you write it, a little bit of virality within the company because people like being a part of something and they will also share your posts or your emails with people that they know and sort of that gets spread internally within an organization. The second is to host a team celebration. If you're in person, hosting it in a high traffic area. If you're not in person, taking some photos, even if it's virtually that Zoom screenshot, and sharing it in your Slack channel, in your, whatever you use as your internal messaging communication lines. And so that people see like, hey, this is something fun that we did. This is something we celebrated, but they also associate whatever you're celebrating with your name and your team. Yep. This is an example of celebrating as expected. I think sometimes, particularly when I was working in product, we would like ship something and then immediately move on to the next thing. As in the PM, I already moved on 2 weeks before the thing even shipped because I'm like, oh yeah, we're gonna ship it, so let me already move on. But often it's actually very important not just to advocate when you have this big win, this outsized impact, this unexpected thing. When you're working on a really hard project, it's often good to celebrate milestones and just like delivering as expected, like everything went as planned, because so often, big complex things will go wrong. So remember to pause before moving on to the next thing, put it on the team calendar, bring the cake. This is the best way to advocate and remind people. Sugar helps people remember things. This is biologically proven. They help you keep the memory of what happened and who was involved. And it's a great way of forming bonds as well as advocating for the work that you've done. I'm going to switch gears a little bit from advocating for your accomplishments to ideas. So earlier in your career, you're often talking about the impact of the work that you've done. And that's what we've just spent time talking about. When you're talking about things that you've done, it often happens in meetings. It's usually the same message, regardless of who you're telling. And the order in which you tell people is not critical. So that's why newsletters work so well. That's how you can host a celebration and post a photo to social media. It's like it could just be one to many, right? When you move to advocating for ideas, and so as a leader, you're talking about, your values, things that you think should be done but isn't done today, new projects you want to pitch, new strategies that you believe in. This changes. These conversations often happen outside of meetings. They're often very tailored to the person that you're talking to. So whether you're talking to an executive versus a manager, whether you're talking to engineering versus finance versus legal, you're tailoring the message to the person. And actually order matters. And so rather than one to many, it actually kind of matters who you talk to first, who hears about it first, who gets to spread the word. And broad channels where you're like, hey, let me just send this document out to everybody tends to fail because they require more individualized and specific, what I call a communication strategy for that particular idea or perspective. And so I have what I call a circles framework about how to communicate ideas and perspectives effectively. The way it works is in the central circle, there's your team, there's you and your team. And then in concentric circles outwards are partner teams that you work with, people you didn't know you needed to know. Oh, and the image needs to get updated. And then the outer circle is like executives. And so for most people, when they're first trying to do this, when someone says like, hey, you need to advocate for something, they just start with step 3. They're like, okay, I have an idea. Let me talk to my team. Let me talk to my other teams. Let me have some official meetings. Okay, now let me bring it up in an official leadership review. Leadership review doesn't go well, and you go, what happened? Like, how come people are not bought in? How come people are not aligned? It turns out that the meetings in between the meetings is really what's important in getting buy-in and building a coalition and bringing momentum to an idea. So the first step is actually talking to people outside of meetings. So if you have an idea, if you have something that you want to make happen, pitch it to people during your one-on-ones, on your coffee breaks, in between meetings, to be like, hey, Prague, I got this idea. Like, what do you think of this? I saw this problem the other day. Like, what do you think of that? Do you see the same problem? Make it much more informal and much more casual, and make it kind of you're trying to get their feedback and their take rather than pitching something to them in a very salesy way. And do this with your team, your partner teams, and maybe a couple of people that your partner teams are like, hey, I think this person might be interested that you didn't know they needed to know. But you don't go out very far. Once you've got that first round done, then you can kind of get yourself organized again. And this is where the writing starts to happen. where you say like, okay, let me start putting some kind of document together or some kind of diagram, and start organizing. Hey, here's the problem statement, here's the pros and cons, here's some options might look like. You start to have a bit more structure. And at that point is when I would do step 2, which is to do what you just did over again. But except this time, your pitch is a bit more organized. So rather than, hey, Prague, I've got this idea, you actually can say like, hey, and here's some options that I'm thinking about. What do you think of those options? Like, what do you think of this? Are there other options that, you would be interested in? And again, you're still talking. You're not sending a document and be like, hey, let's comment to everybody, You're still talking and sort of making it feel like they're a part of the process. And you go out a bit further. You start with your team, partner teams, but you go out a bit further. More people you didn't know needed to know, right? And that's when you start really getting the, hey, these people are for it, these people are against it, here's who's concerned, here's why. That's what you're really trying to get at. Like, who is really excited and who's kind of like, I'm kind of against this idea and here's why. And this becomes important in the third step, is when you get to third step this time, you're really going into my battle is kind of like my favorite analogy. You're building your coalition. So you're saying, okay, who agrees with me? Who's going to help me convince others? You're talking to those people first. And you're having some more official communications, official meetings, maybe some notes get sent out after those meetings. It's more of an official conversation, but you want those official conversations to happen with people who agree with you as much as possible first, because then you're building momentum. You're saying, hey, lots of people like this idea. Like, here's who all likes it, and here's some influential people at the company who like it. Then you get to the harder conversations of people who you've already talked to, but like they're not as for it, and you figure out the right ways and strategies to convince them. And this is the point at which you actually get to likely the executive leadership levels, where you're actually saying, hey, I want approval for this, or I want formal resourcing for this. And it's only at this point where these meetings eventually, get to a point where a decision is made. And so it's quite an involved process. Like, a lot of people underestimate what it takes to, land a particular priority or a new perspective. This is even a simplification of it, but there's a lot of informal conversations that need to happen outside of the official forums.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing this. It's interesting because I feel like sometimes we actually I can see exactly what you're saying, but I feel like sometimes we sometimes get advice that is almost the contrary of, one of the things that, Asians can struggle with doing is brainstorming, especially in a group. And this idea of you've got a whiteboard and let's just throw ideas against the wall, throw spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks, right? Because often the very nature of brainstorming is that 80% of what's spat out is probably crap. In reality, is probably not very good, and we are hypercritical. And even me using the word crap kind of shows you that, right? But but that's the whole purpose of brainstorming, right? And so this process is a bit of the idea refinement to make sure it's a good idea before you share it. And I think in many cases when we brainstorm in a group, Asians often struggle with, just throwing out random ideas, whereas non-Asians are just like, oh yeah, boop, 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 right? And so I've often talked about that as being one of the Asian challenges, being more comfortable with failure, with bad ideas, being comfortable with ideas that aren't, fully baked. And this is almost kind of like saying, no, we really do need to fully bake things. And maybe it's a context of who you're baking that with, or, who you're pitching that to. When it's just your manager and it's your team and you're just firing off the hip, that's one thing. But if you're trying to get advocacy for an idea with senior executives, you've got to have a little bit more runway behind you. But even there, though, isn't there a risk that somebody's going to steal your idea and go present it before you do?
So there's a lot there. I want to say a few
Sorry.
things.
Yeah, I just went off for an hour.
So
Sorry.
one, on the group versus individual, I actually think step 1 and 2, a lot of this happens individually. I'm not saying go have group brainstorms. I'm saying one-on-one, like when we go for coffee, when you and I are about to start a meeting, I kind of nudge you. I'm like, hey, Prague, like, have you heard about this idea? Hey, Jessica, like, I've got this idea. As a product person, it's always I've got this idea, but like you have your version of that, of like, hey, maybe this, I just ran into this process and it was really painful. Like, have you had that experience? Like, what do you think of that? Right. And it's a very informal conversation. You can't really fail because you're not really even pitching anything yet. You're just trying to say like, hey, here's a maybe potential thing that I see, and maybe I have an idea that I am passionate about. And it can be with anyone. It could be your manager, it could be a peer. If you're uncomfortable, you could start with like lower stakes conversations, right? Peers that you trust more or people who are on your team. But even with your manager, it's not an official, like, let me advocate for this as a thing that we must do. It's I ran into this problem today. Did you have this problem? Like, what do you think of this as a potential solution? Is that a good idea or a bad idea? Right? That's the step one conversation. And then it does get more formal because you want to use formality to your advantage, because by the time it gets formal, you've already done the homework. You've already said, let me test out my idea. Let me talk to a bunch of people. And so when it's formalized, you know where everyone stands in terms of, whether they're for or against. And you have ideally a strategy of how am I going to convince the people who don't agree to also agree. And so I actually highly recommend not making it formal until you know those things, and not like officially pitching it until you know those things.
Got it. Got it. Super
Yeah.
helpful. Thank you thank you for elaborating in that way. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. And then on your last question of like, what happens if someone steals your idea? Let them steal it and then correct the person who comes to you and says, hey, this was Jessica's. I heard this from Jessica. You're like, yeah, that came from me. In a way, they're helping you. And so I would not be shy. So this is where the advocacy comes in. I would not be shy about correcting that, because if you don't, it does become their idea.
Yeah, it's I one of the questions that came in the audience and is kind of similar is how do you get a credit for the concept when working for a team, while working for a team with a team? How do you get credit for an idea that you put out there when the team is like pitching it as their own, I guess, or whatnot?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would ask, why do you need the credit? So it often comes down to, why does the credit matter? Because usually it's not the idea that matters, it's the impact that the idea had that matters. And so usually the thing that people are fighting over is who gets credit for the impact. And usually one of the ways of saying who gets credit for the impact is who had the original idea. But I think that most teams have moved on from that direct connection, because they know that regardless of who had the idea, there's a lot of work involved and many people need to put in really hard work for that idea to even become reality. And so I would actually go back and tie it to, is it important to claim that idea? Or are you really trying to solve for something else, which is like, how do I make sure I get the impact, associated with the work that I did?
Great, great answer. Thank you.
You're welcome. That was actually the last thing I had prepared. Happy to jump into a Q&A more formally. If
Yeah.
you are, looking to connect, here's my LinkedIn as well as the URL for my coaching. And I think we will put up a poll at the end where we will be raffling off a couple copies of the book that I wrote, particularly to help women and minorities break through to the C-suite. It's called The Uncommon Executive. So I look forward to sharing more of that with you all.
Yeah. Before you stop your slide share, one of the questions that came up early on is some of the elements that you had up there. How do you see the model minority myth perpetuating some of the situations that we have from an advocacy standpoint or so forth? You had a bunch of different, one of the slides before, you had a bunch of different elements around culturally, what we do and don't do, and so what we feel comfortable with doing and what we don't feel comfortable with doing. But model minority myth is more external, perceptions and so forth. So any thoughts around the model minority myth and how it pertains to these challenges as well?
Yeah, so I think that, assuming we get our own heads out of the model minority myth and we get comfortable advocating for our work, because growth does happen outside the comfort zone. So getting comfortable advocating for it, the question becomes, okay, if you're no longer perceived as somebody who's just going to quietly do the job, and in fact, now you want credit, now you want a raise, now you want a promotion, you're no longer the easiest person to manage on the team, like what happens, right? And this is where knowing your value in the organization and where you stand can help you figure out how far to push and how aggressively to push. I think that many Asians, I find, underestimate where that line is. They are too afraid to push. They're too afraid to sort of be a difficult person to manage. And I am very often when I'm coaching, I'm saying, don't be the easy person to manage. Like, as a manager, I hate it when people say that, but know your value in the organization. Know, like, what you're bringing to the team and to the organization, and then ask for the things that are associated with that. And because if you don't, no one else is going to. And so often there's a big gap between where you think you're going to be really annoying and sort of run into that stereotype versus where your bar actually is. That said, there are people in the opposite situation where they start advocating for things, they start being the squeaky wheel, and they get shut down. They get told, like, hey, no, we just want you to do the work. And that is where I have a question of, are you in the right environment? Because it's no longer about changing yourself. It's about finding, are there other people who will respond differently? Are there other teams, areas, environments, types of work that are more open to this type of conversation? Because it's no longer about you trying to change who you are. If the goal is to get to a point where you're advocating for your work and you're getting promoted and you're being seen in a leadership role, there's no way around it, right? Like you can't, there isn't a world where you don't have to do that and you still get to the other side. And so the question becomes, if it's too treacherous and if the bar is like way too low and the stereotype is way too strong, then you kind of need to find your way around it. And I do think that depending on your power and influence at that point in the organization, it may or may not be a battle worth fighting, right? Some people ask me, like, well, should I try to change the perception? Should I try to change the stereotype? I'm like, yes, you should try. But depending on, again, your power and your position and all those things, like, depends on, it varies how successful you might be in trying to change that perception.
Yeah. No, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Folks, if you can hang on for another 7-8 minutes, then we'll have the poll up where you can put in your you can answer the survey and put in your mailing address for a chance to win one of the books. We're going to be sending about between 22 and 25 out, depending on how the math works, but a decent number. And of course, you can find that on any reputable seller of books. I think most people go to a specific website, but I'm not going to advocate for that publicly. So we're trying to change our in our household. We're trying to change our purchasing habits. So, but another question that we have early on: how do we overcome the fear of speaking up to advocate for ourselves, especially to those that we see as authority figures? Are there any tips that you've learned with somebody who is maybe not just one level up, but maybe 2 or 3 levels up? Any, that can be, comfort zone adjacent, if you will, to try and help us as we navigate to that.
Yeah. So I think there's a mindset question and then there's a skill set question.
Okay.
So the first is addressing the fear, which to me is a mindset question. It's what's the mindset you're coming in with? What are all the fears that you have, right? Around you say something silly, something going wrong, etc. What are all those things? Where does it come from? And then figuring out how to counter it in your mind. And so everyone does that a bit differently. For some people, I would think about like what gets you energized, what gets you excited, what gives you confidence, and I would go do those things. And so for some people, it's practice, and so it becomes like, okay, rather than go say the same thing that you're gonna say to your C-suite executive to like 5 other people first, right? And practice it and like see what questions they have, see how they respond. That way, you're like, okay, at least it's not the first time I'm saying it. This person maybe won't react that differently to it. The second is really trying, for some people, it's about getting to know that person ahead of time. And so maybe it's not the first time I talk to this person that I'm like, hey, did you know I worked on this thing? Right? There's maybe a few previous interactions first. And then on the third or fourth conversation, you're like, hey, by the way, here's the thing that I work on. Now, there are people who are very comfortable doing it on the first meeting, but maybe for you, it takes a few meetings, and that's okay. It's another version of practice where rather than practicing the advocacy, like the content, you're practicing talking to that person and getting to know that person really well. And I think the third is really just kind of pushing yourself to do it often with someone 2 or 3 levels above. What I mean by that is the more you do it, the more comfortable you get. So one of the benefits I got early on in my career as a consultant is I got thrown into these rooms with C-suite executives, and I'm like, oh, they're just people, right? And you get very comfortable very quickly because you get exposed to that very often. And it's just by nature of you were in those rooms and you realize people are people. And so I think if there's a way to do that and just get more exposure to the executive team, to those different forums, it'll also make it less intimidating. Or if you have friends who are not at your company, who are more senior, who are willing to give you like 5-minute time of day to be like, hey, I want to pitch you this thing. How would you respond in an official, like more professional manner? That can be helpful as well.
Great tips. I think one of those points was one of the things that was in my mind as well as I was reading off that question. I've had we have a number of young professionals who volunteer with us here at SASE, and as we set up opportunities for them to meet with executives or whatnot, usually their biggest fear is, okay, like I don't know what to talk to them about. I don't know how I can, prepare myself and, ask them the killer question and, show up in a like, I'm awesome, amazing, whatever type of, and have all this pressure on themselves to perform impeccably while missing the fact that that person is a human being. Right. And part of that is cultural, in that, our cultures back home, often the CEO is seen as a larger than life figure, right? They are not just they are more important human beings in general. The value of that individual is greatly exceeds the value of the everyday person. And that's how society in those cultures sometimes actually sees them. Whereas in the Western world, it doesn't, one vote, one person. We know there's money in politics, but that aside, there is this notion of one vote, one person, and more of a democratization of the value of a human. And so there's a difference in responsibility, but similarity in worth as a human. And that's why, in the West, it's rare that you address the CEO even by Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so. It's Jim or Frank or Debbie or whatnot, right? It's because, whereas you'd never do that over in the East, would never do that in India or in China or in Japan or anything like that, right? Very, very different. And so ultimately here, one of the beauty pieces is, even senior executives, they're human and they honestly want to be treated like humans. They love just, if you have a one-to-one set up with them, they love talking about themselves. Ask them a question about, hey, so I noticed, I'd love to hear, we transitioned from this and this. Can you tell me a little bit more about how that was? Now, don't just ramble for 3 hours, but if you go in there hyper prepared, where, whatnot for networking type of conversations, that can actually be less fun for them, less enjoyable. And so part of, what I took from what you mentioned, to kind of syncs with that idea of they're human, treat them like humans. And then it kind of takes some of the temperature down as well. So
yeah, for sure. And I think that, there definitely like there's an idea around human value. I think there's also often a concept around like the executive's time is more valuable. Like you
Yes.
have to like be worthy of their time in some way. And I do think to that extent, some of that extent is true. And so going into the conversation, it is worthwhile to have done some prep of like, how can I be of value to that person? And some people set that bar really, really high. Like I must find the thing that they've never heard of, and like, this amazing holy grail. But what I tell people is actually one idea is just to focus on what you know, because they don't know what you know. So as an executive, as someone who's been the CPO and CTO, I don't have the like when I was doing that role, I don't have the on the ground view. So the most valuable thing someone on my team could tell me is like, what are you doing today that you're struggling with? Like, what challenges are you facing? Like, and why? Right. And you still got to pick and choose. I don't want you to go and complain and vent to your, C-level executive. But your perspective, which is 100% true to you and cannot be wrong to those people who are afraid of failure, is the thing that's of value to the executive. And so I wouldn't be afraid to use that as a part of the conversation to be like, I see this, I feel like this, I see this challenge, and see how the executive like responds to that, because that helps them actually know what's happening on the ground.
Yeah. So a great example. And the, access to executives, and somebody's talking about, that in the chat regarding, in a virtual work environment and whatnot, but access to executives can be challenging. A great way to get access is the mentorship programs, is the ERG programs that, I presume many of you got here through your ERG. But I mean, that's part of one of the reasons why you should volunteer for your ERGs, because it gives you more opportunities to have conversations that are not specifically about the number of cases that were shipped yesterday, and actually get to know some of them as humans. And ultimately, those personal relationships can pay. You still have to deliver your business, but those personal relationships can make all the difference in the world. So because people are just inherently gonna, it's human nature to trust people that you have a relationship with, right? to trust more. So yeah. Let's see where we're at with time. I'm gonna take one more question. No, I'm not even sure which ones I'm missing yet. Here's, I'm just going to steal Riz's from the last one here. If execs embrace a mindset shift where they prioritize vulnerability over authority, wouldn't it foster a culture of empowerment, openness, collaboration, and humilities? Would it allow execs to lead authentically, build trust, and inspire meaningful transformation? I don't know if you're reading that as well. And I'm not sure if there's a question there, but what are your
Sounds like a
thoughts
great statement. I agree with it. I think that it's funny because Eastern cultures are very authoritarian, right? A lot of them are lead with authority rather than lead with more of a servant leadership, empowerment, and openness. And it goes back to what we were just talking about, which is, treating humans as humans and everybody has their value. I do think that the Western culture does a good job of that in many places, where it's not just about your formal authority, it's about your informal authority and your informal ability to influence. Now, we are group creatures. Humans are group creatures. So even without formal authority, there's always informal authority. And I think this is something that people sometimes feel like is like a bad word or a bad concept, but it's just human nature that there's always a power dynamic and there's always this idea of who has more influence and less influence. And so I think recognizing that, whether you're in the position of power and influence or not, and what effect that has on others, I think that is a part of strong leadership, is knowing when to sort of wield that additional influence and when not to.
Yeah, no, said very well. So Yue, can you believe it? It's been 55 minutes already.
Time flies.
Time flies. We must be having fun, right? So let me share my screen real quick. So I want to thank Yue for her time. Thank our sponsor Dow for making this program possible. The reason everyone was able to register for free is through that sponsorship, which allows us also in this scenario to send out books. So with that, we have a quick survey. Jessica just popped it up. There are multiple questions on here. Please answer all three. And Jessica, is there the and actually does it have three as well as the no? Is there a no the
it's not, but I
it's
will
not
take,
because it's going too fast.
so I will look at who's filling out this
Mhm.
and
then
critique it with, because we did ask for the addresses. I thought I had added it to this poll, but it must have
Got
been the April
okay,
one.
so we'll cross-reference the survey responses with the
Yes.
registrations to figure out who's in the poll for who's in the who's in the pool for getting the free books. So with that, go to saseconnect.org/webinar. You can sign up for the next two webinars if you haven't done so already. So what's powering your engine with Sarita Vasa in February, and then book giveaway. I put that out of sequence. And then Crystal Than in March, on March 11th, with masking, integrating professionalism and authenticity. You can follow us on LinkedIn. That's the best way to stay in touch. We generally do all of our programs through Asian ERGs. If your Asian ERG is not connected with us, please reach out to us at pro@saseconnect.org. And with that, thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate your time. Hope you had a wonderful hour and it was well worth your time. And Yue, it's like, I forgot to mention, everybody, Yue is calling in from Barcelona. Or sorry, Barcelona. I have to say it with the TH. That's the correct way in Catalan. But so she's ready to go to bed. So Yue, you are welcome to go ahead and go to bed. Thank you
No
for your time.
worries. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Good to hear from everybody. Stay in touch.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.